part 4 of our airbrushing basics series, we're going to talk about spraying and cleaning your airbrush. But before we do that, let's take a minute or two to talk about safety equipment and tools that we'll be using when we airbrush. In regard to safety, one of the most important tools I have on my workbench, or safety pieces, is this airbrushing booth. This booth has a lot of area for me to spray in and move things around. It has a great light so I can see what I'm doing, but more importantly, it has a spark-proof motor. The spark-proof motor eliminates any chance that caustic fumes or flammable fumes could ignite a fire. If you don't have an airbrush booth, make sure that your space that you're working in is well ventilated. A lot of open windows, fans in the windows, draw out any of the fumes, get them outside. You don't want them around your workbench. And also, if you don't have a spray booth with the spark resistant motor, make sure that you don't do really long extended periods of spraying and create a lot of fumes and vapors. So keep it short, make sure you draw out or vent out all the fumes and vapors. Speaking of fumes and vapors, you don't want to be breathing them in either. So make sure that you protect your lungs with a mask. If you're spraying waterproof or water-based paint or alcohol-based acrylics, things like that, you can use a cloth mask. Make sure you cover your face nice and tight so you're not breathing any of that in. If you use lacquers or enamel-based paint, make sure that you have a respirator. This is really important. Those fumes are really caustic and they can hurt you, so make sure that you cover your face. Don't breathe it in, because once it's in there, it's going to stay. So respirator or cloth mask, very important. Also, protect your skin. Get yourself a box of these rubber disposable gloves, nitrile gloves. I always keep a box on my workbench. When I'm done, I just pull them off, throw them away in the trash can. I keep a sealed trash can with a lid so that when I put the stuff in there, I can seal it off. And once I'm done spraying everything, I tie up the bag inside and throw it away. So make sure you protect your skin, protect your lungs, and ventilate the area that you're working in. So let's take a little look at the tools now. Let's talk about some of the tools that I have on my workbench here. The first thing we'll talk about is when we mix paint, what do we use? Obviously, you have your bottle of paint from whatever manufacturer. I keep these little glass cups on my workbench, and you can see they have little gradations on them. They have little marks on them so that I can measuring marks. How much paint, how much thinner. As we all know, most paint you have to thin down. Not all, but most paint. So you want to know how much paint and how much thinner you're putting in and mixing it together. So these little glass cups are really great. I don't use plastic because if I use lacquer thinner or enamel thinners, it could eat into the plastic. So I always use glass cups. The other thing you want to have on your bench are empty glass jars. These are important because when you spray and you're airbrushing, you're always going to have some extra paint in the airbrush when you're done, most of the time. What I like to do is I like to pour off the excess paint into a jar and seal it. That way, when I go back later and I have to touch up, I already have some pre-mixed paint. You just pour it right in the airbrush and spray it. Plus, you don't want to waste paint. I mean, it's expensive these days and you don't want to just throw it away. So glass jars, all the different manufacturers make them. They're cheap. Make sure you get them. I always have about a half dozen of these on my bench. As far as transferring the paint from the paint thinner into your paint, you want to use these little pipettes. These are little eyedroppers, basically. You can get them in, these are plastic ones that I use for water-based and acrylic paints. And you can also get glass eyedroppers to use for lacquer thinners and so forth. They come in little packs. You can see I have an AK set here. Come in like 8 to a dozen. These are great little pipettes. As far as cleaning your airbrush goes, this little overspray pot is a handy tool to have on your workbench. You say, what is that? This is basically for when you're in between colors. I'll spray a color, and when I'm done, I'll clean it out, put my paint into the jar, and I'll put some thinner in there and spray it through. So when I'm spraying thinner through the airbrush to clean it, I put it in this little pot and spray it. It catches all the fumes and it catches the thinner, and I can empty it later, clean it out, and you don't create a lot of fumes and excess paint in your work area. So little overspray pot. I think Vallejo makes these. Great tool. When we get down into cleaning the airbrush, we use two different types of tools. We use these little cotton swabs. I like the Tamiya swabs because they make about 4 different sizes. Little pointy ones, little square ones, little blunt ends. So these little cotton swabs are really useful. I always have these on my workbench. I also keep nylon brushes on my workbench. These are just little plastic nylon brushes. Different manufacturers have different types. So these are used to go into the nozzles and clean out the nozzles. And you'll see when we clean the airbrush, you'll see how I use these. Also, I always keep some inexpensive plastic paint brushes. These are like craft paint brushes, so that when I put some thinner into the cup to clean it out, I can swirl it around and clean the cup off with these cheap brushes and not worrying about, damaging a really good paintbrush. Always keep paper towels on your workbench. You're going to go through a lot of those. They're important. And the other thing I have here that's nice is this little airbrush holder. I just got this recently and it's really useful. You can mount a couple different airbrushes on there as you're spraying. Holds them nicely on the workbench. So that's tools. Let's take a look at spraying and cleaning your airbrush. The three key factors to spraying your airbrush are operating air pressure, paint mix, and technique. And we're going to take a look at each one of those individually. So let's get right to it and do a little bit of spraying. We'll be using two sources of air, a hobby compressor and a can of Badger Propel canned propellant. We will need to adjust the air pressure for fine work done at low pressure and heavier work done at high pressure. The compressor needs to have a regulator to adjust the PSI, or pounds per square inch. The propellant can's pressure is adjusted by turning the regulator knob. The pressure on the can is more limited than the compressor. Lower pressure, 10 to 15 pounds per square inch, is used for fine work. Your paint needs to be mixed thinner to avoid clogging the airbrush tip, and you also require more coats of a thinner paint. High pressure, up to 20 pounds per square inch, is used for heavier work. At higher pressure, the paint doesn't require as much thinner. The tip doesn't clog very easily, but you will have more overspray. Most paint requires thinning for use in an airbrush. The basic consistency of your paint should be like that of whole milk. We'll be thinning Revell Aquacolor paint with their Aquacolor Mixed Thinner. With most paints, I start with a 1-to-1 or 50-50 mix of paint and thinner and adjust the mix by adding more paint or more thinner. Revell suggests a 4-to-1 mix of thinner to paint for aquacolors since it is fairly thick out of the jar. Once you've thinned your paint to a milky consistency, load it into your airbrush and do some test spraying on a test sheet or an old model. Make sure to match the air pressure to your paint mix. Let's look at some airbrush techniques and good practices. Always spray in short parallel strokes to the surface. Don't spray too heavy and maintain a constant speed. Make sure to stay parallel to the surface. Learn to trigger. Best results are achieved by a good constant motion. Start your motion before pressing the trigger. Follow through the motion after releasing the trigger. Masking or frisket is used mostly when more than one color is applied. A new frisket is cut for each color and covering any area that should not be sprayed. Here's an example of using Badger Photo Frisket to create reverse stencils. After the paint has dried, remove the frisket to reveal the areas that were masked off. Tape is also a great way to mask things off. Frisket and masking tape produce hard edges. Create soft edges by using soft materials such as a paper towel held slightly above the surface to create a soft edge. The only way to become proficient at airbrushing is to practice, practice, practice. Do some of these exercises on your own to hone your skills. One of the most important aspects of airbrushing is learning how to keep your airbrush in good shape, or how to clean it. So let's take a look at how to clean your airbrush. To clean your airbrush between color changes during a painting session, you'll need some airbrush cleaner or the appropriate solvent, glass jars, and a paintbrush. First, save the excess paint that you didn't spray for future use. Next, use a pipette to add some cleaner to the airbrush reservoir. Use the paintbrush to clean the inside of the reservoir before spraying it through the airbrush. I like to do this twice to make sure the reservoir is nice and clean. Now remove the needle, wipe it down with some cleaning fluid, and dry it with a paper towel. Now reinsert the needle, and you're ready for the next color. To clean the airbrush at the end of a painting session, first, carefully remove the needle. Next, carefully remove the nozzle assembly. Now use a nylon brush dipped in cleaner or solvent to clean the main chamber of the airbrush. Next, use a nylon brush dipped in cleaner or solvent to clean each piece of the nozzle assembly separately. Now clean the needle. Now it's time to reassemble the airbrush. Be careful when assembling not to damage any of the parts. Finally, spray some cleaner or solvent through the airbrush and you're ready to go. Well, there you have it. That's spraying and cleaning your airbrush. We all have different airbrushes. I use Badger and Paget. There's other brands out there, but all these techniques and ideas are pretty much the same and they all apply to all the different airbrushes. So take what you've learned, apply it. Hopefully you'll do some really great work, and until next time, happy airbrushing.